So today, as part of my alternate history videos, I have what if the French Revolution never happened? Um, this is a pretty big deal. As with all the alternate history videos, I will be looking at the plausibility of the reasons why these events were different and how much I agree with what the assessment is by this person on the outcomes of events, how the world would have been different. It's hard to say for sure with any of these videos what would have happened, but it's always fun to take a look and see what possibilities were out there. So let's dive into the video and take a look.
The French Revolution, perhaps one of the most misunderstood and generalized events in Western history. To us Americans, we're often taught that it was but a counterpart to our own revolution, a glorious liberating of a people from under the boot of a distant and disconnected tyrant. But the causes and players of the revolution are not quite what we've made them out to be. Moreover, observation would cite that the revolutionaries had either failed to achieve their goal or simply never stopped achieving their goal, as the French Revolution will only be the first of a few which seem to follow a common pattern of destabilizing the current order, establishing an increasingly liberal republic, and later foregoing the republic to give extreme authority to a leader who represented the now status quo. I've discussed this in my original video of if the revolution never happened, but the primary motive for it was to enact increased liberalism. Generation after generation seemingly demanding greater equality, more social services, and so on. Kings and emperors were tolerated so long as they delivered an egalitarian policy and provided more for the public. A theory as to the cause of this trend is that following the first successful revolution, countless nobles and intellectuals were hunted down and driven from the land, or worse. France at the time also had the largest population in all of Europe, and most of that population was composed of peasants, many of whom by nature weren't notably intelligent and were dependent on the system the nobles had created to survive, despite how poor conditions may have been. The aftermath of the revolution likely led to a brain drain and a culture of dependency on strong guidance, as it would have been the only system the peasants and their children would have known. The lesser educated rely on the more intelligent for guidance after all, and that opened the door of control for men like Napoleon, who championed egalitarian policy, but were also firm leaders. Whatever the case, things were never really the same for France after the revolution, but what if the revolution never happened? Of course, the peasantry wouldn't tolerate the system forever, but what if their needs could be satiated well enough that thoughts of revolution simply don't manifest? Essentially, France would need to embrace just enough egalitarian policy to keep the peasants too comfortable to revolt. That anyone who suggested such a thing was only trying to bring hardship to a good system that the peasants were content to live in. There's a common misunderstanding of Louis XVI as well, commonly believed to be a pampered and spoiled bigwig who didn't give a rat's hat about his own people. But the contrary is actually the truth. Louis was fanatic about the Enlightenment and an early practitioner who very much wanted to liberate the peasants from their serfdom and indebtedness to the nobles, to grant them a fairer hand in politics, to draw up a personal bill of rights for the lower class, abolish the death penalty, which he believed inhumane, and overall alleviate the burdens beset upon the poor. The reason you've probably never heard of this is because these so-called progressives who took charge weren't truly the voice of the people, but a new class of elites who took advantage of the peasant outrage to eliminate their opposition.
Yeah, so Louis XVI was actually very progressive, as he said. He wanted to change a lot of things and help the peasants out a lot. Again, we don't hear about this because of what's basically propaganda from the revolutionaries. However, another issue was that at the time, they weren't entirely sure how to do that. So, alleviating a lot of the stressors that are on the peasants, alleviating economic hardships, granting rights, exactly how do we do that without sacrificing a monarch system? How do we do that without changing the very nature of our economy? Doing such things took revolutionary actions that Louis could not really take, especially even though he was a king and he was an absolute monarch, he still has in a way to answer to the other nobles. If enough of them were to rise up against him, he's also in trouble. So taking any drastic action that would have taken power away from the nobility and the aristocracy would have been potentially disastrous for him. As he did have political rivals, there were other factions that wanted to see other families on the throne. Um, so a big issue is he didn't really know how to do things while still maintaining his power and the security of the country. Um, Also, it really hadn't been done that much yet. Eliminating peasantry had not really been uh, a huge thing that had happened yet in Europe. Um, it had begun to in certain areas, absolutely, but it was often violent. It was often, if not violent, it was very difficult. It came with a lot of drastic changes that I don't think anybody in power, including Louis, was actually ready for. Um, so when the revolution happens, initially, it, it it looks like you have the same problem with the revolutionaries, is that they want these changes and they don't know how to go about it, so they pretty much just resort to violence, because they're also met with resistance by other people who don't know how to give them what they want. And in a way, the revolutionaries didn't entirely know what they wanted. They did in theory, but when you actually asked for specifics, it wasn't always as clear. So from the very beginning, the revolution was pretty messy, just in concept. It wasn't as clear as like the American Revolution, where we want freedoms, and then when that wasn't available, we want independence. This is a much more convoluted system, because the social structure of France was a mixture of old and new. It was starting to modernize a little bit. We had a working class starting to come into existence, but most of it was peasants. And then you still had lords and an aristocracy, and you had a king, obviously. Um, so it was still a very old system that was trying to embrace new ideas, and on no side did they really know how to do that, especially without resorting to horrible violence like they did. So,
Proposition during the Reign of Terror. It's actually quite interesting, the more you reflect on the contributing factors and the effects of the French Revolution, how much of a similarity you find between it and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There
That's
were
true.
anti-religious elements which arose, a purging of the aristocracy, a seizing and redistributing of wealth, and a council-based system which was ultimately replaced by a dictatorial ruler. Because
yeah, actually, that's a very interesting point that he makes, is that the French Revolution, especially in its earliest incarnations, but really throughout it, was actually very similar to Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. As he said, they purged the aristocracy, they purged the upper class. They were looking for a lot of rights. They were looking for a lot of economic equality. There was redistributions of wealth. There was all sorts of things that went on, and they were both looking to put in a more of a republic, and ended up with dictators. Um, Marx had not written his books on communism yet, but there is talk about how the French Revolution was sort of a pre-Marx socialist revolution. Socialism, communism obviously didn't exist yet, but had Marx written manifesto and his other writings, by the time this had happened, we may have seen a different outcome. We would have seen probably some form of socialist system tried to be put in. Whether or not it works, and whether or not someone like Napoleon still takes power or gets rid of that, is very much up for debate. But I think that there's a lot of commonality between the two, as he states, and I think it's a very, very good point to make, that there is a lot of commonality between the two, and it's something that's not explored a lot, but it should be, because it's important to look at these two events, and see the similarities between the two, sort of as a pre and post Marx revolution of a very similar nature.
Because history is, of course, told by those who win, we've only gotten one side of the story, and frankly been misled as to the more nefarious actions of the French revolutionaries, though that's not to say all had sinister intent. In actuality, it was but a few small but highly influential men and groups, such as the Hebertists and the Sans-Culottes. The peasants, for the most part, were useful fools who were used as tools of destruction to bring down the current establishment. Now you might ask, well, why didn't King Louis enact any of his policies, since it seems they would have saved him a world of trouble? Well, the fact is that he didn't have the power. That's right, despite being an absolute monarch, the power of the king was near useless in France without the okay of the aristocracy and the clergy. The old regime of France was perhaps best described as a theocratic oligarchy, as the church and nobles held real power, while the king was but a face to represent both. And the nobles did halt Louis at every attempt he made until eventually he lost faith in real change and stopped trying. But what if things went differently? What if King Louis was more outspoken and assertive about his beliefs, and in doing so reaches the ears of Enlightenment idealists, would-be revolutionaries, and the downtrodden subjects of his kingdom, allowing him to raise from the people a king's guard, to reclaim authority from the nobles, to re-establish himself as an enlightened monarch? People were certainly willing to fight for a better life in France, and the peasants generally didn't outright hate the king. To most he was still holy, a divinely selected leader. Had he as king engaged more directly with his people and shown his sympathy, he well could have taken the reins of his country back for the better. Using his newly found power, Louis would abolish taxes which burdened and targeted the peasants, allowing them to retain more wealth and gradually improve their qualities of life. Prisons are reformed to have more humane conditions, and the death penalty becomes a thing of the past, meaning no guillotine either. The most anti-reformist of the nobles would see imprisonment for treason against the king, while the rest were kept loyal through a show of strength by the people. A number of public humanities are established, such as schoolhouses and medical centers open to all, but eventually progress would need to slow. France at the time was saddled with a heavy debt from its role in the American Revolution. Wealth allocated from the funds of the nobles subsidized recent improvements, but that would eventually run out. However, with the peasants satiated and fully behind Louis, he would now have the time necessary to dig France out of its financial hole. Immediately, the US is turned to as an obvious source of income. The newly formed nation would need allies and trade partners, so France assumed it could take the young nation under its wing as an imperial big brother. In our timeline, the US rightfully refused to involve itself in the French Revolution, and at the time had a non-interventionist policy so far as military action went. But Louis may be able to bargain an exclusive trade partnership between itself and the US, sweetening the deal by offering the Louisiana Territory as their first exchange at a greatly reduced cost. The land was going largely unused and drew resources away from domestic needs, so much like Napoleon did, Louis would trade it away for some much-needed cash, and this time around a new trade partnership. France would also build an alliance with fellow Bourbon Kingdom Spain for the sake of mutual defense. A dwindling economy meant reductions to the French army. A not-so-bad trade-off since, as I previously mentioned, France had the largest population in all of Europe at the time, meaning a deep pool of reserves to draw upon, although not necessarily the best trained or best armed. This could be improved if basic training was made part of the curriculum or even the cost of enrolling in a public school, to essentially make of the massive peasant population a citizenry of soldiers. Because in this timeline Napoleon never rises to power and invades Spain, the kingdom remains stable and is able to become wealthier and more industrious than it had been in our world, opening the possibility of even more trade opportunity for France. France's relationships would be fairly complementary. Louis, as an enlightened monarch, is able to be the bridge between monarchist Spain and enlightened America. And while united for the sake of mutual benefit, they also shared a common disdain for Britain. France and Britain were of course rivals. Britain basically destroyed Spain's empire, and the US still recognized Britain as that tyrannical force across the pond. But Britain had its own allied powers which stood in solid parallel to those of France. In America stood British Canada, and Iberia was Britain's long-standing ally of Portugal, and Britain itself being right across the channel from France. The French would be in a recovery process, but not yet ready to combat Britain should tensions arise, and so Spain alone would not do. France sought out yet another ally in a pact of defense against Britain. The ally would be Austria, not the most reliable of comrades, but still a force to be reckoned with. This period of history could have very easily become a powder keg if things had unfolded the way we've described. However, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars swiftly diffused it as the European coalitions came together against France instead of each other. Austria and Prussia were on the brink of conflict over territorial disputes, with Britain likely to support Prussia. Spain was making considerations to exert further dominance over Portugal, and Britain, after harassing US ships, was facing what would become the War of 1812. It's not clear what France would have done this time around in Napoleon's absence, though in our world Louis had hoped to originally use the American Revolution to expel Britain from India. Had conflicts arisen between...
Yeah, so in this time period, we see a similarity. Once again, we are looking at a similarity to future events, where we see an alliance system that is stacked, that if a conflict broke out, it would have a domino effect, similar to what we see at the beginning of World War I, where this country picks a fight with this country, and then their ally jumps in, and their ally jumps in, and then another ally jumps in, and another ally jumps in, until next thing you know, all of Europe is at war. This was a little less complicated than that, whereas a lot of them weren't necessarily allies, but they were more the enemy of my enemy, or my friend sort of ideas. Prussia and Austria had been, they'd been at it for so long. A lot of the Germanic states, including Prussia, were Protestant, and they had been since the Protestant Reformation, which started in Germany, whereas Austria remained predominantly Catholic, and its rulers were Catholic, as were the rulers of France and Spain. And yet England, the UK, had become Protestant. So it would have, that sort of divided lines of a bit is on religion, whereas that's not necessarily would have been a war on religion. Those religious differences that caused wars in the past and caused differences in the past definitely would have helped set the battle lines for any future conflict. We could, without Napoleon rising to power and rampaging Europe, as he says, you do sort of see a powder keg set up. We do see sort of dominoes starting to be lined up on each side, where one jumping into a war against another can lead to all sorts of chaos. It can lead to domino effect in which another country falls into another, and a pan-European war breaks out. We possibly could have seen another World War One scenario. We could have seen a World War One a century before it actually happens. But especially with the empires involved. But it's very interesting to see how things were actually stacked in a very similar way to World War One, in sort of a powder keg situation that was oddly diffused by Napoleon just going on a rampage and taking on everyone. Had that not happened and the powers had remained the way they were, it's kind of questionable what would have really have happened. It's very interesting to think about.
Between the US and Britain in Napoleon's absence, this might offer a second chance to conquer the region for itself. If we allow things to move as they have been, we could see a division or dispute within the Holy Roman Empire trigger an annexation of lands by Prussia, or an invasion of the empire which would in turn force Austria to mobilize in defense of the Germanic territories. All the while, Britain is pulled into the conflict by Prussia. Conflicts could also be initiated by British impressment of American soldiers and the harassing of US ships, triggering the US to invade Canada in retaliation. Spain could also attempt to seize back Almeida, which it had occupied during the 1762 invasion of Portugal, bringing Britain to support Portugal as it had in the past. Regardless of where the conflict starts, France's response to each would pull the others into the conflict. France backs Spain's invasion and attempts to halt the British Navy from reaching Portugal. Meanwhile, a land invasion of the Holy Roman Empire is launched to expel Prussia. The war in America draws away British resources from the European front, and France, hoping to compound the problem, supports some faction within India into a rebellion against Britain. There was a possibility for most of these conflicts to have happened during the American Revolution. However, France abstained from direct conflict, as it wasn't by this point very confident in its own capabilities and feared a repeat of the 7 Years' War. This time around, France believes it has a chance. The Kingdom of France would still retain General Napoleon as a military asset, and put him to use in Germania before circling him back to fight the campaign in Iberia. Of course, France's military and political leadership is fairly different in this world. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it means a good deal of the old generals and tacticians would have survived the conflict and been able to pair their capabilities with those of Napoleon, who would no doubt still ascend to a high military rank. Having defeated most of Europe single-handedly in our timeline, there's little doubt that Napoleon, now with the immediate support of Austria and Spain, wouldn't be able to grasp a landslide victory. The British Navy still breaks the French blockade and pairs a naval bombardment with a land push to drive Spain out of Portugal, but Napoleon manages to push back and occupy a large segment of northern Portugal. A stalemate is called and border cities are annexed by Spain, but Portugal retains most of its occupied land. Austria comes out victorious and reassumes Germanic dominance, assuring that it become the power to unite Germany instead of Prussia in this world. The overseas wars ran to a stalemate type of situation as well. Though the conflicts had favored Britain, the peace treaty would require the liberation of Quebec as well as the coastal Indian lands from British rule. This victory would trigger in France, as had been seen in the US, an era of good feelings, marked by both economic and territorial growth. The new French Empire potentially expanding further into the Italian and Germanic states post-war, and maybe even establishing a Bourbon Union with Spain under a shared monarch. The US goes about its typical path with much more liberty and expanding northward, now that British Canada had been weakened along with the British domain in the Americas overall, perhaps later forming the basis for a Spanish-American type war with Britain to expel them from Canada and the Caribbean. The British Empire's time in the sun was over. The spotlight had been taken by France and its allies. The European paradigm had shifted again in a victory for both Enlightenment ideals and the culture of Catholicism. In our world during Napoleon's campaigns, there were talks between France and Russia, peaceful talks. Russia didn't always fear the French Emperor Napoleon, at one point seeing him as a potential ally for a grand plan to conquer India and divide the land mutually between their domains. But peaceful discussions vanished as it became apparent Napoleon had all of Europe in his sights. In this world, that fear never manifests, and the French campaign to drive Britain out of India is followed by a dual invasion of the land, securing a highly prized asset for the empires, which in the coming years would bring them a wealth that had fueled Britain's colonial endeavors for over a century in our world. This special relationship which would develop between France's allies would open the door for deeper Russo-American relations. In our world, the two had actually been rather close up until the Napoleonic War, then picking up again, but cutting things off entirely following the rise of the USSR. In our timeline, Russia did very little with Alaska, but in this world, with the additional resources and wealth brought in from India, as well as greater access to Canadian lands on the side of the US, Alaska may well be developed into a hub for Russo-American trade and resource extraction, perhaps leading to a gold rush, in turn leading to a mass populating of the region. Britain, in lieu of India, may set its sights on colonizing China, Indochina, and Indonesia, probably meaning more opium wars and a greater dominance over the Chinese coast. France, later down the line, would lend support to the US during the Mexican-American War, and in the wake of it lay claim to the remaining Mexican land unclaimed by the US. If the Bourbon Union is established, Spain could justify this as a reconquest of a lost colony, and install a member of the Spanish line to rule more strictly, or if not, France could just as easily install someone else. The American Civil War would prove to be an even greater loss for the Confederacy, as the Union would maintain an alliance with its pro-Enlightenment allies. However, the South could very well stir up a rebellion in Mexico to keep France distracted. Austria, whenever its collapse comes, will retain its Germanic lands and may unite with Prussia to establish a greater Germany. Domestically, France took a gamble making the alliance as it did following such a major political change, and while this war could have just as easily broken France, the nation emerged reborn with a non-hereditary enlightened monarch system, which in time would create a new nobility class out of the families of former kings to carry on France's progressive transition as much as becomes necessary. This might eventually backfire if it goes too far for, say, the nobles or even peasants, and ignite a counter-enlightenment movement to restore more traditional roles. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z, thanks for watching. Support.
Yes, that was a very interesting video. I actually really liked that one. If you notice, I didn't really interrupt him too much, as I often do. I just like to point out the similarities that we see of the alliance system that we see that causes World War I to be as big as it is, existing in a alternate Europe that really was beginning to form before Napoleon took power, before the French Revolution. But a lot of the outcomes of any pan-European war that probably would have broken out would have drastically changed the world. We would not be living even close to the world that we're living in now. So pretty much all of our history from the French Revolution forward would be drastically different. I mean, you don't have the unification of Germany under Prussia. There's no German Empire. There's no world wars. The United States probably takes most of Canada, as he says. You probably see much different in the United States. He brings up the American Civil War. I'm a little questionable whether or not that still happens. Namely because there's less, I feel like there'd be less territorial disputes over slavery. Also, it's hard to say how long the slave trade would have still lasted under this scenario. I mean, it probably would have happened, but it's hard to say for sure. If it does happen, then yeah, the Confederacy doesn't stand a chance, and I don't want to get too deep into it this time. But civil wars that I'm not going to talk about all day, but really the Confederacy never stood a chance in our timeline. If the United States now controls a lot of Canada, and it has an ally in Russia who also has a holding in North America, and you have allies in an ally in France, it's not even a contest because the U.S. alone is much more powerful than they were in our timeline, and they're almost undoubtedly going to get help from the French, as long as the French don't collapse into some sort of internal strife. As you know, later on, if things continue to go in their favor, as it looks like they probably would have, then I think that the French probably would have stepped in. Whereas in our timeline, France was strongly in favor of the Confederacy, and so they were not much help to us at all. Really, nobody was, because nobody who could really actually provide a lot of help sided with the Union. But I think the Civil War is probably the one event that may still happen from this point of divergence. But it would have been different, and it probably would have been shorter, and it's questionable whether or not it would have happened. But I mean, even in our timeline, I've argued many times that the Civil War should have been over much sooner. A lot of it had to do with the ineptitude of a lot of Union generals, and the fact that the Union sort of fought the war with one hand tied behind its back up until the near end, when they finally just wanted the South to just end. They just wanted the South to just stop and just end the war. So they finally unleashed their full potential against them, and they unleashed General Sherman against them, which that alone is enough to persuade somebody to give up. But yeah, this is a very interesting scenario because it's one event that really changes the world, and we look at civil wars and we look at revolutions as internal events that happen within a single country, but more times than not they actually have massive reverberations that go across the world. The American Civil War drastically affected the Europeans. The French Revolution, completely changed, obviously, Europe, and it really changed the world because France's defeat allows Britain to expand more than France does. The defeat of the Spanish and the Italians by Napoleon really sort of sets the stage, especially for Spain, really sets the stage for their decline. We see, again, with the Soviet Revolution, with the Bolsheviks taking power in the October Revolution, setting up the Soviet Union, we see, obviously, a massively different world where now the old Russia's gone, and we see the rise of Stalin. I don't think a monarchist Russia would have been enough to defeat the Nazis. I think it took someone like Stalin to do it. Russia certainly had the manpower industry to do it, but I think it took a certain ruthlessness that only someone like Stalin had. And of course, there's the Cold War. So we look at internal conflicts in countries, and we have to look at them on a world stage. Most of the time, we have to look at them as more than just internal conflicts, because 9 times out of 10 they're going to have effects on either just their region or even on a global scale. But they will definitely have effects on their region, and they will likely have effects on a global scale, even in countries that are not considered to be very significant. Even today's standards, things like the Syrian Civil War and everything have drawn a lot of attention and have affected politics in places like Europe because of refugee crisis and things like that. So I think anytime we look at internal revolutions or in civil wars or something like that, we have to think about the global scale of it. And I think he does a very good job of that in his video. I was very impressed by the way he divided up the countries and set up a sort of a possibility or a likely scenario of any kind of pan-European war. I don't know that I fully agree with how it would have turned out, but only because I feel like in order for it to work the way that it did, France would have had to remain stable on the inside, and if it gets drawn into a conflict that turns into a bloody conflict, if it turns into conscription and pulling peasants into war, the reforms of King Louis may not have been enough. The peasants may have rose up for not wanting to have to serve in a war, and for the shortages that naturally come with any kind of war during this time period. So internal stability in France is really the biggest question here. Is if the revolution doesn't happen, does it not happen forever, or does it not happen for 10 years or 20 years? Is it something that's going to happen just later? That's really the big question here. But I think that assuming that one doesn't happen for 10 to 20 years, that's when we can say, well, okay, this pan-European war is probably going to happen. The United States definitely benefits no matter what happens. They get to Louisiana no matter what. So yeah, it's a very good video. I think it was very informative and very well thought out. I really agree with a lot of what he had to say. Like I said, the only real issue I have is just whether or not France would remain stable. But I really like the mirror that he makes to World War One and to the Bolshevik Revolution, because that's something that's very important too, is to realize history does repeat itself. A lot of the same things do happen again, and we can kind of start to play with ideas like, what if Marxism did exist during the French Revolution? How would it have been different? How would the outcome been different? Because the French Revolution was extraordinary revolutionary, extraordinary bloody, and they were looking for there was all sorts of crazy ideas that came out of it, most of which never took hold, but all sorts of crazy ideas were formed. So something like Marxism existed, which I feel like is sort of what the people were clamoring for. People seem to be looking for a Marxist-like society, or some kind of socialist-like society, before socialist societies had really been brought to the forefront by Marx and other writers, and other philosophers. So it was really almost like looking for socialism before it exists. But it's a very interesting thing, very interesting topic, and very interesting video. But that's enough for me, so I'm going to go ahead and end the video right there. If you have any other videos, whether it's alternate history or regular history, that you want me to react to, please put it in the comment section. I will definitely get to them. If you like the video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.